Welcome back to the Health Optimization Medicine podcast. My name is Dr. Scott Sherr, and I'm one of your hosts. And today's episode is a fantastic one with Dr. David Perlmutter. I'll give you a quick bio on David before we get started. He's a board-certified neurologist, 6-time New York Times bestselling author, on the board of directors and as a fellow of the American College of Nutrition, and currently serves as the director of neuroscience research at Bren Therapeutics. He received his MD from the University of Miami School of Medicine, where he's awarded the Leonard G. Roundtree Research Award. He serves as a member of the editorial board of the Journal of Alzheimer's Disease, has published extensively in peer-reviewed scientific journals, including Archives of Neurology and Neurosurgery and the Journal of Applied Nutrition. He's also a frequent lecturer at symposia sponsored by institutions such as the World Bank, IMF, Columbia University, Scripps, New York University, Harvard, and more. He has books in 32 languages: The Surprising Truth About Wheat, Carbs and Sugar, Brain Maker, The Grain Brain Cookbook, and The Microbiome in the Brain. And his newest book that's coming out in August 2026 is called Brain Defenders. And that's what this conversation was all about. Dr. Perlmutter and I went deep into these particular types of cells that he focuses in the book called microglia. He talks about how these particular cells, the immune cells of the brain, are essential. And when they're in the wrong format, when they're in their M1 format specifically, they destroy brain tissue over time, and they're the cause of brain neurodegeneration. No matter what the final etiology, the final presentation or condition, you have immune system dysregulation at the microglia level. So we go further. We talk about what that is and how that happens. And we talk about mitochondrial function and the shift from oxidative phosphorylation to glycolysis. Talk about why this is happening with insulin resistance and toxins in our environment and medications that people are taking, toxins in our food, and obviously sympathetic activation and other aspects of mitochondrial stress. From there, we go in to talk about what can we do about this, right? And so Dr. Perlmutter has a great way of describing this in his book: dietary interventions, lifestyle interventions, of course, the basics. What are you going to eat? What are you not going to be toxic with all the time? And then in addition to that, we went even further. We talked about advanced mitochondrial testing. Is there utility? What's coming out? What kind of testing can be very helpful? Looking at optimal ranges versus normal ranges. That was a big part of this conversation at the end, which was so important. We talked about novel supplementation, things like lithium or creatine and others that can be so helpful for the brain. We, in addition, at the end, talked about breakthrough technology and therapeutics, including things like GLP-1s, mitochondrial transplants, even gamma rays to your brain, infrared light, and more. This is a power-packed, hugely fun recording for me because I've been a fan of David's work for a long, long time, especially as it relates to hyperbaric therapy, which he's a pioneer for back 20 or 30 years ago. So without further ado, please enjoy this episode with Dr. David Perlmutter. Please don't forget to get a copy of his book or sign up for a pre-release copy of it at braindefenders.com and enjoy. See you. Dr. David Perlmutter, it's very nice to see you again. How are you?
I'm great, Scott. How are you doing?
I heard you just first got off just a trip from from Antarctica, right?
Antarctica, as they say down there. Yeah, it was breathtaking. And I actually wrote a blog about it because, it's an interesting situation down there that in late 1950s, the entire planet came together and said, we're going to work together and cooperate and not exploit Antarctica and do research. And what a model, for what could be. I was thinking about that down there when you come back and see how things are currently in the world.
Right.
What a model for how people can get along and come together and work towards a common goal. So it was beyond, of course, the natural aspect of what you get to see when you're down there, which was breathtaking.
It's amazing. And on so many levels. I mean, we used to talk about this with space, even though, there was the space races initially, if we could just coordinate and collaborate, what the possibilities could be. So it's super cool. You got to see it in action, especially with some amazing nature throughout the time, I would imagine.
Oh yeah,
too.
it was great. And the good thing, I went with a exploration group called Quark,
Okay.
and they really allow you to get into the environment. And so, we got to do kayaking and stand up. We didn't just stand up paddling, but that was available.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's really to be in a kayak and going around the icebergs and looking at the penguinos and the
Yeah.
seals and whales right by you. Oh my gosh, it was really breathtaking. So There actually are tours that will allow you not only walk on the land, which we did. We went in the Zodiacs and did some walking, but snorkeling as well in a dry suit. And I'm looking forward next time to being able to do that. I would really enjoy that.
Well, I mean, talking about a good brain reset, right? I mean, that's what you're all about. And your new book, all about the microglia specifically, is a really cool topic and one that I've been diving into deeply, actually, in very, very many ways in my own clinical practice. So I'm excited to kind of dig it in with you. But I think, before we get too far into the weeds, and I have a lot of questions for you, I think maybe defining some terms would be helpful for people because, like just like we dropped acid with you back in the past. Now we're going and optimizing these cells called the microglia. So maybe if you can give us a little bit of a
Sure.
primer
Let me give you
on what they are.
the
Yeah.
short list on the glossary.
Yeah.
So, and let me give a bit of a preface to that because so people know why we're doing what we're doing.
Yeah.
For decades, we've pretty well focused as it relates to what makes a good brain go bad on the fact that the brain tends to accumulate some strange proteins. In the case of Alzheimer's, beta amyloid, and in Parkinson's, alpha synuclein. But we've now come to a different understanding of just over the past couple of years that really fundamental across the board in all of the common neurodegenerative conditions, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, Huntington's, MS, really is a focus on what's going awry with the brain's immune system. The brain's immune system, here's the first term to define, is made up of cells called the microglial cells. So
Mhm.
as you and I pursue our discussion today, we're going to be focused on these cells, microglial cells. And again, these are part of the brain's innate immune system that are basically determining its destiny. And the empowering part of Brain Defenders, the book I wrote, is that our day-to-day choices influence whether those microglial cells are going to be supportive, allowing us to grow new neurons, allowing us to build new synapses, shoring up the blood-brain barrier. We call that the M2 microglia,
Mhm.
or we foster the development of the evil twin, the M1 microglial cell that destroys our neurons, gets rid of synapses, and threatens the integrity of the blood-brain barrier. Whether the microglial cells are friend or foe depends on their metabolism, how they are utilizing glucose in the presence of oxygen to make energy, ATP. And it turns out, and this is, I think, one of the most important points of my entire book, that the metabolism and therefore the function, friend or foe, of the brain's immune cells mirrors our body's metabolism. So, what does that do? It brings into focus all of the things that you've been talking about for years about keeping our metabolism in check, optimizing our body metabolism, our body weight, our glucose levels, our insulin functionality,
Mhm.
our blood lipids, our blood pressure. All of these things converge on many things throughout the body, but for our time today,
Mhm.
converges on whether these brain immune cells are going to be, charting our destiny in a good way or a bad way. And we now understand that things like Alzheimer's, for example, are far more involved in what's going on with these microglial cells than looking at this beta amyloid, which is
Right.
the target of pharmaceutical development, which has abjectly failed. Science magazine or Science Tech, I think, in 2020 called the discovery of the role of microglia in brain health as the number one discovery for the year of 2025. So,
Wow. Yeah.
what we're talking about today is absolutely right on the edge and most importantly, incredibly empowering.
I love that. And so it reminds me of your trip to Antarctica, where you could chart a course when you'll die down there because there's ice and you'll get stuck in it. Or you can chart a course when there's actually free water and you can actually float through it, right? And how you're charting that course is really related to how these microglia are being activated, either in the M2 or N1 category, right? Um,
That's right.
yeah.
And you think about the early explorers in Antarctica. They didn't know. They didn't have GPS. They didn't really have much ability to forecast the weather, and it
Right.
was kind of a roll of the dice. That's where we've been in brain health until
Right.
just recently. It's pretty much the messaging was live your life however you choose, eat whatever you want, and when you start to becoming cognitively impaired, forgetting Wi-Fi codes, grandchildren's name, where you are,
Yeah.
all manner of cognitive dysfunction, there's going to be some wonderful pharmaceutical fix for you. Well, I welcome the day. Believe me, I welcome the day. But we aren't there yet. And yet there are so-called Alzheimer's drugs
Hmm.
that don't work in any meaningful way, that are potentially life-threatening and certainly
Right.
very risky to take anyway, with about 23 to 28% of people taking these drugs having brain hemorrhages. That's
It's
not fun.
crazy. Yeah.
And we can do better. We can really emphasize not treating Alzheimer's, but preventing it in the first place. That's the ultimate principle of wisdom, according to the,
Yeah.
the yellow emperor in the 4th century BC,
Oh, is that right?
curing, preventing a disease before it has really reared its ugly head. We know that we can do that now, even independent of whether you carry the so-called Alzheimer's genetic predisposition or not. There's so much we can do, and that's what we'll talk about.
Yeah. I know in the end of your book, which we'll get to it later, you talk about some promising advanced therapeutics and pharmaceuticals and technologies and some things like mitochondrial transplant, which is super interesting. But the bulk of your book, obviously, is on the things that we can do every single day to optimize our brain health. And one other term I thought might be helpful to define that you talk about early in the book is also, and you've been alluding to it already, but maybe just to define what you mean by immunometabolism. And there's also this sort of extension of this word which might be helpful that I've been talking a lot about with recently in colleagues is immunosenescence as well.
So immunometabolism is a contraction of the terms immunity and metabolism,
Right.
both of which have been front and center in our scope of interest, for a long, long time.
Hmm.
It turns out that they're intimately related, that our metabolism, and people understand what that means, keeping our bodies in shape, basically, keeping our blood sugars under control, the things I mentioned earlier.
Hmm.
Our metabolism profoundly, moment to moment, influences the set point of our immune systems, whether our immune systems are doing their job or they're overacting, in which case we are reacting even against our own tissues. We call that
Right.
autoimmunity, or underperforming, in which case we are then susceptible to not only infection, but also cancer. Immunity involves surveillance, looking at our bodies, scanning for cells that are inappropriate and then can replicate. But I think before I get to combining immunity and metabolism,
Hmm.
recognize that we are now looking upon the immune system as having a much larger responsibility, especially as it relates to the brain.
Right.
Yes, the immune system in the brain is there to go into action when we have a viral infection, bacterial infection, whatever it may be. Even trauma, for example, the immune system is activated to help deal with the debris and
Hmm.
help healing take place. That's kind of the classical view of the immune system. But I like the metaphor of the fireman or the fire person in the firehouse. Yeah, that person's in the firehouse waiting for something to happen, and then when there's an alarm bell, off the fireman goes to deal with the problem. But what is that person doing between bells? He or she is at the firehouse making sure that all the equipment's working, shining up the fire engine,
Yeah.
testing all the valves, making sure that things are working. In other words, doing maintenance and upkeep. And that's what the immune system is really doing all the time in our brains. It is ensuring that our synapses are connecting appropriately, that we can grow new neurons, who knew, when we need them,
Right.
called
We didn't know that for
neurogenesis,
a while.
and
Yeah.
fundamentally, two other things. That is keeping the blood-brain barrier, which we really depend upon, intact, and keeping inflammation at bay.
Hmm.
Inflammation is a really central mechanism in terms of what makes a good brain go bad. And here's where we marry that term, the immunity term, to the metabolism term to come up with this notion of immunometabolism, a term that I really love
Hmm.
because it's the center of my life right now.
Hmm.
And that is that the function of these immune cells is dictated by their metabolism. We look at our
Yes.
biology textbook at the cell, and the cell has within it these things called mitochondria, the powerhouse of the cell. That's in the best of situations when our immune cell in the brain, the microglia, are doing their job. They're keeping the neurons intact and the synapses functioning, and everybody's happy. Cleaning up debris, really very important. And it's dependent upon their mitochondria supplying them with adequate amounts of energy so they can remain in what we call this M2 configuration, the loving, nurturing microglia. Now, that microglial cell can shift to become the evil twin, the M1 evil twin microglial cell. And when it does so, that is the cornerstone of every neurodegenerative condition that you can think of. And I want to come back to that thought in just a moment.
That's a
But
big one. Yeah.
that is a shift that happens when these immune cells have their metabolism shift. Again, immunometabolism. And their metabolism shifts when they are confronted by products that are produced by too high of blood sugar, by inflammation, by
Right.
excessive free radicals, reactive oxygen
Right.
species, any manner of damage, what we call damage associated molecular patterns, or things that are created when there's damage in the brain, or PAMPs, pathogen associated molecular patterns, when there's an infection in the brain, and
Right.
it stimulates the conversion from healthy cells, supportive cells, to being destructive. Most importantly, this metabolic shift going away, sort of turning its back on the wonderful gift of the mitochondria to another form of energy production that won't be on the quiz, but is called glycolysis. When
It's
that
on my
happens,
quiz.
yeah, the points to remember is that characterizes the shift of these immune cells turning their backs on us, destroying the brain. But the important point is we can shift them back. Remember, Scott, I mentioned earlier that the metabolism of these cells mirrors the metabolism of
Right.
your body.
Systemically.
So
Right.
when we
Yeah.
do things to
Right.
improve our body's metabolism, the play in the brain is shifting those M1 destructive microglia back to being supportive, and you become the architect of your brain's destiny.
Cool. Awesome. I think you said that so well, David, where it's the M1 state, it's this destroyer state, as you call it, of the microglia that's causing all of our neurodegenerative conditions. And I think that is a base for everybody listening, is like what I got out of your book when I was reading. It's like, this is really the lowest common denominator. And then you took it even further, which is it's mitochondrial dysfunction, which, as we know, I mean, I was looking at statistics recently, about 94% of US adults have some element of mitochondrial dysfunction as well. And one thing I just have a small question about the
That
M1
would be
is,
metabolic dysfunction.
yeah, metabolic dysfunction, which is really a correlation to mitochondrial dysfunction,
Agreed.
when
And
it comes
I'm
down
so
to it.
glad you
Yeah.
said that. That's absolutely perfect.
Yeah. When I think about M1, the only thing small like nuance, is there any utility in the short term for microglia cells, the primary immune cells of our brain, to go into that M1 state?
Absolutely.
Okay.
And that's a great point.
Yeah.
Just like we need inflammation, although it's
Right.
always castigated, we need inflammation, to do certain things. We need the M1 configuration, or what we call phenotype, of these microglial cells from time to time to help us in terms of the immediate response to an
Right.
event.
Right.
Problem is that when we have diabetes, or we are significantly overweight, or have other metabolic issues, they tend not to want to go back to being supportive again. So, yeah, that's a very good point. There's a time and a place for all of these
Right.
functions to occur, but it's the shifting back then to being M2 supportive that is compromised by the things over which we do have control. And now this explains why we see such an increased risk of Alzheimer's, for example, in the type 2 diabetic. We've
Right.
wondered about it before. We said, well, yeah, maybe there's some pro-inflammatory activity from this glycation of our proteins, or the
Right.
increased inflammation, or the insulin resistance, knowing that insulin in the brain does some other things aside from allow glucose to be used as a fuel in certain areas. It
Sure.
acts as a trophic hormone,
Sure.
but it allows us to understand that this explains. Here's a great example. If you experience head trauma out of the blue,
Right.
you're riding your bike, somebody cuts you off, and you have head trauma, your risk for a worse outcome is increased if you happen to have been a diabetic at the time of that event. Now, think about that. Why on earth would that be? Because now that you're diabetic, yeah, you're going to shift your M2 to M1 phenotype of your microglial cells because you've been injured. But again, it's that shift back that you depend upon to regain your functionality. So your risk of morbidity, prolonged morbidity, more cognitive issues after the same event is greater because of this issue. And again, as a neurologist, we've learned to really be very specific about how we approach specific problems like Alzheimer's, being unique as it relates to other neurodegenerative conditions. We would never consider that we're going to approach Alzheimer's in the same way we approach Parkinson's, in the same way we approach MS or Huntington's chorea, whatever it may be. But this is a new reality because it turns out that this shift of the microglial cells from M2 to destructive M1 is the fundamental across all neurodegenerative conditions. And that's a hard, forgive the pun, pill to swallow
Yeah.
for neurologists because, we've been trained to learn these specific protocols about each individual
Right.
neurodegenerative condition. Now we're being told, hopefully, that no, as a matter of fact, there's something way upstream of all the bad stuff that goes on that then defines each of these diseases. As a matter of fact, the data and the research that paved the way for this was actually Parkinson's research. I talk about it in the book
Mhm.
that took place in around 1982, 1983. Give me a minute. It's an interesting story. There was a Dr. J. William Langston working in his office in Stanford one morning, an attending physician, and the residents burst in his office. You got to come down to the emergency room to see this patient because we don't know what to do. We don't know if we're going to admit this guy to psych or we're going to admit him to neurology. As a
Classic.
resident, you don't want to
Classic.
admit
Yeah.
patients if you don't have to. So
Yeah.
we're pushing him into psych. It's
Always.
obviously a psychiatric issue. So they go down to the ER, and there's a patient there who is stuck like a statue with his arm sticking up in the sky. They had brought him in from the jail. No one knew what to do with him. They couldn't get his arm to go down. And Dr. Langston pondered it and he really had never seen anything like it. And over the next few days, several more people came in. And some of them were less afflicted. And he examined them. And some of the presentations I give, I actually show the video
Hmm.
of what it looked like. And for all the world, it looks like Parkinson's disease. But who ever heard of Parkinson's coming on, in one day?
Right. Acutely. Yeah.
And the interesting thing that united all these experiences was they had all been doing IV heroin from the same source. And it turns out it was a designer drug. It wasn't actually heroin. And this, because there was a flaw in the production of this designer drug, it was contaminated with something called MPTP, which was is a mitochondrial toxin. And what Dr. Langston surmised was that damage to the mitochondria in a certain part of the brain affected its ability to make dopamine. Therefore, Parkinsonism manifested. He treated them with standard of Parkinson's care for their symptoms, and oddly enough, they improved. Well, not oddly enough, it made sense now in retrospect.
Right.
But here's the part that's so fascinating that really played a fundamental role in why I wrote this book, and that is several of the patients died, 10 to 15 years later. And Dr. Langston, still really interested in this, actually wrote a book about it, about the story of the frozen addicts. He examined their brains, and what did he find? That yes, the area was depleted of dopamine-producing cells, the area called the substantia nigra. But when he looked at it on the microscope, what he found, I think it's exciting. I hope your viewers find it exciting. He found that the microglial cells were still active 13 years later.
Wow.
Still activated in the M1 configuration, gobbling up these neurons that make dopamine.
Crazy. That's crazy.
That's basically indicating that this was a fire that was set and it hadn't gone out. It was still smoldering.
Right.
Why is that important? Well, we talk about the cytokine storm, for example, in COVID, where suddenly these microglial cells get shifted over to the M1 configuration and send out all these cytokines, inflammation throughout the brain. And, that's a tragic situation. Then patients recover. But about 20% don't fully recover and haven't recovered to this day. We call them, we characterize them as having long COVID. And what's going on with them is quite similar to what Dr. Langston described back in 1983. That these microglial cells got shifted from being supportive to being destructive. Not a cytokine storm now, but a cytokine drizzle brought on by the continued activation of these cells. We see the same thing in Alzheimer's. We see the same thing in MS. We see the same thing in Huntington's, and certainly see the same thing in Parkinson's. That doesn't necessarily get induced by doing IV drugs, but can be induced by exposure to paraquat, trichloroethylene, which is found in industrial cleaning products, and even head trauma.
Right.
There's a wonderful book written about this by Dr. Ray Dorsey that really makes it clear that Parkinson's is a man-made disease and is a consequence of toxin exposure. So the mission is to look upstream at the microglial cells as being, the real entry point as to where all, the downstream damage is taking place. Target those microglial cells with the various techniques I talk about in the book. And then, we explored, as you mentioned, what the future holds and how so much research now has shifted over to looking at what can we do from, an invasive and, a technological approach, pharmaceutical approach, targeting microglial cells, putting them back to being supportive and really bringing an end to the progression in these devastating degenerative conditions like Parkinson's. And as it relates to Parkinson's, oddly enough, it's already been done.
Hmm.
Published in April 2024
Yes, I saw this.
in
Yeah.
highly respected New England
Yeah.
Journal of Medicine. What did they find? And I'm not, let's be clear, I'm not advocating all Parkinson's patients use this approach.
Right.
I'll preface my statements with that, but a study of, I think, 130 Parkinson's patients versus control, 1-year study, evaluated these patients over the 1 year using what's called the Unified Parkinson's Disease Rating Scale. It basically measures how well they're doing. And what they did was half the group got a GLP-1 agonist drug like
Hmm.
Ozempic, but a different one that seems to penetrate into the brain a little bit better. And what happened to the group getting the GLP-1 agonist drug is that their Parkinson's disease was fully arrested, i.e., they weren't cured, but they made no progression. They did not worsen at all during that 1 year,
Hmm.
in contrast to the control group that, as one would expect, got significantly worse over the 1 year period of time. Now, again, let me be clear. I'm not saying this is ready for prime time. But what do the GLP-1 agonist drugs do? They specifically bind to our microglial cells. They specifically enhance mitochondrial function. And as everyone now knows, they improve body metabolism. It's why people are taking them to lose weight. And what were they originally designed for? To bring blood sugar under control as a treatment for diabetics. So again, I'm, as you can see, animated about the
Yeah.
result of that study.
Of course.
But I discussed it in the book, again, not to say, GLP-1 agonists for one and all, but I
Right.
am saying that this is pretty profound evidence that when we target metabolism, and then as a consequence of targeting metabolism, we target our microglial cells, good things can happen.
Yeah. I love that. And I think a big part of your book talks about how to defend your brain. And of course, this is where you're kind of going with talking about GLP-1s and some of the novel therapeutics and pharmacologics and things like that, which I do want to dance with you a little bit on as well, because that's like the fun, exciting, like you talked about the study. But as you all very well describe in the book, and you have for decades now, is that a lot of this is based on foundations and foundational biology and lifestyle and diet. And I know you talk a lot about it, but maybe you can just give a little bit of an overview here of what you found to be the biggest interventions so far from a diet, lifestyle perspective, and even some supplementation if you'd like,
You bet.
specifically when it comes to the microglia.
Well, let me contextualize that first of all, because we talked about risk for these diseases. I mean,
Hmm.
diabetes certainly is a powerful risk for having your brain decline, or as I mentioned earlier, having a worse outcome from head trauma. We live in
Of
a
course.
country
Yeah.
where 30% of people age 65 and over are diabetic now, not having a little insulin resistance or pre-diabetic. That's, being full on diabetic, which, as I mentioned, may as much as fourfold increase your risk for becoming an Alzheimer's patient. And, as it relates to, being pre-diabetic, the number is certainly
Staggering.
much
Yeah.
larger. It's a
Yeah.
third of US adults. And the scary part about that metric is that about 90% of these people don't know it. So that's why we do podcasts like you are doing, and we write the books that we write, because people need to be aware that Getting a fasting blood sugar every year is interesting. People kind of train for that. I know I have a friend who says, I'm not drinking for a month before my blood work. I want to
Yeah,
say,
right.
that doesn't tell you that's bad information, but
Right.
we can do a lot better than fasting blood sugar each year. At the very least, if you're doing blood work every year, by all means, at least check your fasting insulin levels. So we've really got to do the very best we can to look at these metabolic indices and realize that there are a billion obese people on our planet. And, we have in America right now, 40.3% of American adults is obese, with extreme obesity being at maybe about 16% of adults in America
Yeah.
right now. Think about that. That's extreme obesity. So
Yeah.
that sets the stage for us to then look at then what are those lifestyle interventions. And you've been talking about these things for years.
Yeah.
My mission here was to contextualize them in the context of brain health, and that takes a little work for people to realize that, well, what's going on in my body is going to affect my brain. I mean, and it does. I mean, we have 1 in 9 American adults
Yeah.
right now over the age of 65 is demented, and I think it's fully preventable. So
Isn't it 1 out of
let me
3 if you live to 85, I think you're gonna be demented too? So I think
50-50. That's a
50-50
flip
now.
of a coin.
Wow. Yeah.
So then what are the big inroads?
Right.
And I think we've got to get people moving. We've got to get exercise to happen. Exercise is the fundamental for improving metabolism, improving certainly body weight, improving glucose levels, improving insulin functionality, reducing inflammation, and secondarily through the effects of muscle activation on creating chemicals
Mhm.
called myokines that are good for metabolism and good for the brain.
Mhm.
So, we don't really consider our muscles to be endocrine glands. You ask people, what are your endocrine glands? These are things like, the pituitary, the adrenal glands. These are glands that secrete chemicals that have an effect elsewhere in the body. Well, guess what? Your muscles are a powerful endocrine gland. The muscles are a wonderful pharmacy to create chemicals that go throughout the body, including the brain, and do great things. When we exercise, we trigger the brain to create BDNF, brain derived neurotrophic factor. That turns on the growth of new brain cells. Who wouldn't want that?
Right.
That fosters microglial function to be in the M2 configuration, and it helps us form new synapses. So, the idea of exercising to activate our muscles to create this array of chemicals like irisin. Irisin goes into the brain and turns on the production of BDNF.
Mhm.
Interleukin 6, we used to think, well, that's a pro-inflammatory cytokine. That's a bad thing. No, when your muscles make interleukin 6, when you're exercising, that activates pathway for those who want to know what it is, the AMP kinase pathway
Mhm.
that helps us with blood sugar regulation, helps our bodies increase
Metabolic
fat
rate.
utilization
Mhm.
as a caloric reservoir. So again, that's what our muscles do. It's why exercise is so darn important. The bigger our muscles, the more of those chemicals they're going to produce.
Can you be too
And
big though, David? Can you get too big? What do you think? Too big
yeah,
of a
you can overdo anything, as
Yeah.
you well know. And I'm sure you've been through overdoing. I
Well,
certainly have been through through that myself, still paying for it over the years. But that said, yeah, but I think, we tend to experience as we age something called sarcopenia. And that's a
mhm.
fancy term meaning that we lose muscle mass. And I really think that this is first and foremost in terms of our obligation to our metabolism and our obligation to our brains, and that is to not lose muscle mass. How do we do that? We do it with a combination of aerobic training, strength training, or resistance training, and also I think stretching and balance training are very important as well.
Of
I
course.
say that why? Because if you don't stretch, you're going to injure yourself, and if you injure yourself, then you stop exercising. And if you don't work on your balance training as you get older, which deteriorates as we age, you're going to fall, or you might fall. Sorry. And if you do, again, you get injured and then you stop exercising, and you
Mhm.
can't afford that.
Mhm.
Exercise is your key to reducing your risk for Alzheimer's. It's that simple. It's also your key to reducing your rate of cognitive decline. it also is your key to increasing the size of your brain's memory center called the hippocampus.
Mhm.
That was done. That was research from a Dr. Kirk at the University of Pennsylvania, who was really first to show the powerful effects using MRI imaging after 1 year of intervention of people stretching versus people involved in an active exercise program, and actually demonstrated an increase in size in the exercise group versus the stretching group of the hippocampus. In the hippocampus, size deterioration was seen in the group that did not exercise actively but did the stretching.
Mhm.
And they also demonstrated improved memory simply with the intervention of exercise. So, the book talks about these incredibly cool new supplements that are targeting the microglia. Exercise is key.
Yeah.
Uh, I would say that whatever diet works for you to keep your blood sugar under control, that's
Mhm.
good. Needs
Mhm.
to be fiber rich to nurture your microbiome. Polyphenol rich means a lot of color. And look at what are the sources of polyphenols in your diet right now. The most common source of polyphenols in the human diet globally is coffee. So there you
Yep.
go. That's a vote in favor. That's a bit self-serving for me because I love my coffee. But
Indeed.
again, colorful polyphenol-rich foods are really what we need to gravitate to. So, and I think we've got to be looking at those metrics that tell us how well we are doing from a metabolic perspective, not
Sure.
just
Yeah.
fasting blood sugar. What is our fasting insulin levels? Should be around 2, maybe 3. Our A1C should be around 5.2, 5.4. You see ads on television for diabetes drugs saying, "I'm so happy I got my A1C below 7." That's not good in
Yeah.
anyone's book.
Yeah.
Brain begins to deteriorate at A1C of 5.8. What is it telling us? Telling us we're already on the scale for insulin resistance. We're paving the road for getting us to being a full-on diabetic. As I mentioned before,
Mhm.
that's a surefire way of converting your microglial cells, your M2 brain defenders that want you to have a healthy brain, to turning their backs on you and becoming M1, the evil twin. That's what nurturing our brain defenders is all about.
Yeah.
Now, I want to just throw at your viewers a couple of supplements they may not have heard of that we mentioned in the book, and then we'll talk
Please.
about some that have um, certainly been talked about before. First I want to mention what I think might well be one of the most important supplements, and that is creatine.
Mhm.
Creatine,
I was going to
either
ask you about that. Yep.
creatine monohydrate or creatine hydrochloride. We're seeing some interesting data coming out indicating that there may be some benefits of choosing creatine hydrochloride, but nonetheless, creatine is a wonderful way to help our mitochondria do what they want to do. In other words, mitochondrial function, metabolic function, keep the microglia supportive. And that said, uh, it's pretty much a tasteless supplement.
Mhm.
I, for one, don't know anyone who's not tolerated creatine. It's very inexpensive, and I don't want to point fingers, but I don't see anyone having an excuse not to take creatine. I have no financial interest currently in any creatine product. I want
There's
to
a lot
make
out there
that
too.
clear.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think a minimum dosage would be 5 grams twice a day.
Twice daily.
In a
Okay.
recent interventional trial, actually looking at individuals who did have existing low-grade Alzheimer's disease, the trial used 10 grams twice a day. There really were no issues that were related to taking that supplement. So
Mm.
really very, very important. Now, an oftentimes overlooked issue that relates to increasing inflammation and free radical stress in the brain, and therefore targets our brain defenders, is elevation of something that maybe your viewers have not heard of. I bet some of them have, called homocysteine. It'd be great if you put a graphic on the bottom right now. It's really important.
Can
Homocysteine.
do. Yep.
Why? Because homocysteine is an amino acid, basically, that can accumulate, and when it does, it becomes pro-inflammatory. It detracts from our body's ability to make something called glutathione, which we need as an antioxidant, as an anti-inflammatory, and to help us with detoxification. And genetic testing can identify people who are at risk for having a higher homocysteine level. It's called the MTHFR polymorphism. About 28% of Americans carry it. I carry it. And what is the fix for that? Whether you have that genetic thing or not, if your homocysteine is elevated, if it's around 11 or 12 or 10, needs to be around 9 or even 8 would be even better, then you have to take a B complex, simple enough, but importantly, it has to be what's called methylated
Right.
B complex. You want to drive that homocysteine level down. That's cool for the brain. Your brain's going to love that. Your brain is threatened by a higher homocysteine level. High homocysteine is associated with an increased risk for Alzheimer's as well as cardiovascular disease. So we can tease apart what should be in that B complex, but as you know, it's going to have B6, methylated choline, might even have some B2, riboflavin, trimethylglycine. We certainly also want to have adequate amounts of magnesium on board and zinc. You will get those in a multivitamin. But these all conspire to help bring your homocysteine level down.
Yeah.
And after about 3 months, you want to recheck that. Some of my patients have actually needed self-administered, they learn to do it at home, subcutaneous injections of methylated B12. Not a big deal. Once a week, people, learn how to give themselves peptides right now. How many people, 20% of American adults has given themselves an injection with a GLP-1 drug. So you can sure learn how to give methylcobalamin or B12 injection, 5,000 micrograms a week, but follow that homocysteine level. There are a couple of other interesting.
Yeah, I was going to ask you specifically about lithium, because I know you mentioned it in your book. If
Yeah,
you have any interest or any thoughts about it.
I did mention lithium. Lithium has been found to be suspect of interest as of late in the brain world. We know that lithium may well be something, a go-to. It's a drug, although there are supplements available.
Lithium carbonate. Yeah, lithium.
You can buy online or at wherever health food store. But there is an indication that this is really important for the way that it shifts the microglial cells.
Right.
Lithium and all the good things that it does targets the microglial cells and helps to shift them from being M1 back to being, or keeping them in their M2 configuration.
Right.
So
super interesting.
When I first wrote the book, that was already about a year ago. I will admit that when I finished that section on lithium, the language was, we're going to need to wait for more research until, I'm full on endorsing lithium. But over the period of time while we were writing and editing, more research came out that really was supportive. So as you saw the language I used, I am supportive.
Yeah. And there's so many other supplements that you talk about in the book. You do a great job. But one of the other aspects I wanted to kind of cover is the testing side of things. And you talk about some of the new mitochondrial tests out there, some of the other testing, like the brain marker testing that you can do. How do you feel about those kinds of tests? I've talked to clinicians, myself included. We're not entirely convinced that the mitochondrial testing is ready for prime time.
I agree with you.
So I'd love to hear your perspective if you want to elaborate on that, and maybe some of the other brain marker testing like p-tau and others that you're thinking about using in the context of all this.
Well, let's first talk about mitochondrial testing. And there is a scan, a test called ME screen I'm looking at. And I've had countless conversations with their development team. I think they've reached the point that it really does have validity.
Okay.
Is it the end all? At the end all, the gold standard is a muscle biopsy, needle biopsy.
Yeah.
Looking
not easy
at
for people to do.
The various stages of mitochondrial function.
Yeah.
Electron transfer and also the byproducts of mitochondrial function versus dysfunction. I like this test though, and I think they've done a great job. They are validated at several academic institutions, so I'm on board with them. And the thing that really convinced me was, they're beginning to demonstrate changes in their results with intervention. That's really where
that was my next question.
Science goes. But I would say that before we get to anything too sophisticated like p-tau 217 and the various beta amyloid markers and neurofilament light, et cetera, the things we talk about in the book, those might be a little bit too sophisticated for people, and I get it. But it is available, and I put the resources where people can get these tests performed. But I think that the big bites, are gonna occur, the broad strokes, by simply looking at the very simple metrics of metabolism. And I think one of the
Right.
most fundamental tests that you can get that is really difficult to perform and requires that you buy something, it's called a tape measure that you put around your waist. And it's funny, because the way I parse that out, but
I love it.
um, it's huge. I mean, the waist to hip ratio tells us an awful lot about metabolism and therefore mitochondrial function.
Mm-hmm.
So, we pretty well, synonymize, is that a word? I don't know.
It
Mitochondrial
works.
function with metabolism because they go hand in hand. As
They do.
mitochondrial function declines, so our metabolism declines, and vice versa. Again, getting us back to the term metabolism. So, this is very simple. Fasting blood sugar is important. More important, better would be looking at continuous glucose monitoring. That gives you such a more granular, in-depth understanding of what your personal blood sugar dynamics are doing during the course of your day based upon your lifestyle choices, your current body habitus, and absolutely your genetics as well. And frankly, that's what you should be caring about, not how my fasting blood sugar each year compares to what is
When you're
considered
training for it too,
normal
right?
or
That's
in the normal range. I
yeah.
can't I have a tough time with that term. As
Yeah.
the hair goes up in the back of my neck when people say, well, yeah, but I'm in the normal range. Yeah, you want to be in the optimal range. If we're working together, we're going to be going for the home run here.
Yeah.
We don't want to be average. That's
Yeah.
what in the normal range is. You sample 10,000 people and you develop a bell curve and you want to be within, one or two standard deviations of the mean, and ain't good enough. Not
Yeah.
at all.
Yeah.
And we're not gonna let you go there. We're gonna say, look, we want your fasting blood sugars maybe in the mid to upper 80s. Whoa, but my doctor said, no, we'll look at the scientific literature and not try to keep it in what the lab reports as being in the normal range. We talked about already fasting insulin and this notion of having an A1C below 7. That is a false goal. We can
For
do
sure.
absolutely much better than
Yeah.
that.
When you think of, I have a couple of just final questions, but one on optimal ranges, 'cause I'm a huge proponent of this. Well, you don't want to be normal for your age. You want to be optimal. Is there a way you define this for people specifically, or how do you create your optimal
Those
ranges?
metrics are out there. When you look at the research that, Brain Defenders is full of, I describe why it is I say this,
Mhm.
where those changes, those inflection points begin in the laboratory testing. So I defend, the idea that I have different laboratory measurement recommendations compared to in the normal range.
Yeah.
So, I think labs are going to say anything below 11 on your homocysteine is in the normal range. That's, uh,
Yeah.
I'll be nice.
Yeah.
That's not good enough for your
Right.
patients, for anyone I'm interfacing with, and for readers of my book. We want to do better. Look, you know, um, we have 6 million Alzheimer's patients now in America, with that number going to double by 2050. And there is no meaningful treatment. So it's all about prevention. And
Right.
these are the
Right.
keys to the kingdom.
Right.
So you're not at the doctor's office saying, I'm not remembering why I go into a room now. And because that's the harbinger to issues down the road that are going to present themselves sooner than later.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
and at point we're told that what you do is, well, then you get into either a clinical trial or you go ahead and take a drug that's targeting beta amyloid. It doesn't work. I wish it did. If it did, I would have recommended it for people, including my own father. And, I'd love there to be a drug. And,
Right.
frankly, lithium has been used as a drug for an awful long time. And there may be some play there. I
Mhm.
even discuss in the book, as you know, the idea that if the research on GLP-1 agonists, the Ozempic-like drugs in Alzheimer's and other neurodegenerative conditions, demonstrates efficacy and safety long term, then I will be supportive. You bet. So, it's a notion of not alternative medicine that's just either A or B. It's integrative medicine, which means I'm going to take a look at A, B, C, and D and value their risk benefit ratio to determine what I think is best for you.
I love it. And you talk one thing on the optimal ranges that we do. So we have a nonprofit that helps train practitioners. We talk about an optimal range somewhere between 21 and 30 years of age. So that's when you're the most optimal, typically, when you have the most optimal levels of hormones and nutrients and things like that to be the most resilient. That's what we try to teach. And that's exactly what you're saying, which is that you don't want to be normal for your age at all. And I just wanted to kind of relay that back to you. And the other aspect of it, because I know that we're running out of time, is you were talking about some of these new, promising pharmaceuticals and breakthrough therapies. And you talked about GLP-1s. And I think that's a great one. Are there any other ones that you'd like to highlight, as we kind of finish up today, about something like things that you're really excited for in the future as well?
Yeah, and let me just say, because you brought up an interesting point about saying that, people in their 20s and 30s, that's what we should look at in terms of determining what an optimal might be, perhaps in terms of hormones, but maybe not.
Hormones. Yeah.
But we recognize that, the seeds are sown for Alzheimer's, for example, in our 20s and 30s. Those
Right.
metabolic precursors begin in those years. So were it only true that people in their 20s and 30s are metabolically intact these days, because they're not.
I know. It's a good point. Yeah.
So we have to take a step back and look at and help redefine what optimal may be. And
Yeah.
uh, how we do that, I think it's a little bit unclear, but I think it's to look at the literature
Right.
and see where people really push these labs and what the outcomes are when people have a fasting blood sugar of X, whatever it may be. So
Good point.
in closing, you asked the question, well, what am I really excited about? A lot, I have to say. The future looks bright. There's one technology that really thrills me. And it's called, it targets something in the brain called gamma oscillation.
I
What
was
is
reading.
that?
Yeah.
There's a beautiful sinusoidal, means up and down like the waves at the beach, background activity in the brain that is called gamma oscillation. When you look at that background smooth oscillation, it's much deteriorated in virtually all neurodegenerative conditions. If you look at that background oscillation in the Alzheimer's patient, it's all over the place. And the symphony is not lined up. There's no conductor. The instruments are playing, but it's cacophony, basically. So forward-thinking researchers, especially a Dr. Li-Wei Tsai, and I quote her work in the book, asked the question, how can we reestablish this gamma oscillation in the brains of Alzheimer's patients? And might that have some clinical benefit? Bring the conductor back on board. And her mission was to find some technology that could do that, with the idea that she would target, guess what? The microglial cells, and bring them back online, bringing back our brain defenders, and helping, get away from that evil twin. And she found in laboratory rodents that if she were to flash a light in front of these rodents in their eyes at various frequencies, things would happen in the brain. And she found that a certain frequency of light would restore gamma oscillation. Wow. They then said, well, it's an innocuous sort of intervention. Let's try it in humans. And found that shining a light at 40 times per second, flashing at a rate of 40 times per second, coupled with sound at 40 hertz as well, reverted the brains back to gamma oscillation, brought the conductor on board.
Wow.
And then she said, well, that what we've got to do is we've got to try this in patients with early Alzheimer's. And really across the board, she demonstrated improvement in comparison to people not treated, or a decline in their rate, a reduction in the rate of cognitive decline as relates to memory. And importantly and excitingly, she demonstrated doing what are called volumetric MRI scans, basically showing how much brain is there, really significant slowing of the rate of brain loss in Alzheimer's patients by shining a light in their eyes and having them listen to a sound with a pair of headphones for a period of an hour a day. Far more impressive results than we've ever seen with any drug that's already FDA approved.
Wow.
So, I guess in closing, that's one of the most exciting technologies, I think, that is on the near horizon line. And there are other things, real powerful interventions. You mentioned, beginning of our time together, mitochondrial transplant. and even technologies using small molecules to target certain receptors on the microglial cells to revert them back to being M2 supportive brain defending microglial cells.
Mhm.
And a report that was published a couple of months ago doing microglial transplants in humans.
Wow, really?
Yeah, so it's the future, it is the present. I think in closing, I just want to say that each and every one of your viewers now has powerful tools to rein in their microglia and revert them back to being supportive and really become the architect of their brain's destiny.
Well, thank you, David. That's amazing. And the last question I'll ask you is your daily non-negotiables for optimizing your health and your microglia. Are there things that you absolutely will do no matter where you are in the world? Because I know you travel, you're in Antarctica, you're in other places around the world, traveling and speaking. What are some of your non-negotiables, no matter what you are, where you are and what you're doing?
I don't know that this targets my microglia. I think it does, and through some mechanism that I'll mention in a moment. But I think the non-negotiable for me every day is expressing gratitude.
Mm-hmm.
I could finagle a way to tie that into my microglia.
Parasympathetic activation and
You bet.
yeah.
Reduction of cortisol,
Sure.
helping
Yeah.
my HRV,
Yeah.
helping me then with all kinds of things like better sleep,
Mhm.
more dedication to exercise. I exercise every single day. Are there days that traveling just makes it, absolutely impossible? You're on a 12-hour flight. It's challenging, but
Sure.
even on the plane, I get up and look really goofy at times, walking up and back. I don't want to get a deep vein thrombosis, all that, but
Yeah. Yeah. Sure.
I exercise, every single day. Just got some new equipment in my gym.
Nice.
That's, I think, really helpful. I've never been a stationary bike user. I now have one that's so high tech. It's great. I get to gamify my stationary bike time. So I really, that's really important. Diets, for the past 30 years has been, something I've
Yeah.
really focused on, but exercise is really key. And I'm grateful I'm a good sleeper. So do I have room to improve? You bet I do. And are there new supplements every week that people are, emailing me about and showing me
Sure.
data? You bet there are.
Of
And
course.
you can only take so many, but I think we covered some of the most important ones, and certainly those lifestyle factors that are really important.
Yeah. Well, I just want to thank you for all your pioneering work for so many years, David. People like me have been watching and listening and going to your lectures for, as long as I've felt like I've had a brain that's been adult sized. So I just want to thank you for all that. And just, I guess, lastly, let people know about your book, when it's coming out and how they can get it.
Braindefenders.com. Oddly enough, that's the website, braindefenders.com. And here's what the cover looks like. Look how proud I am, Brain Defenders.
Love it.
This book is published in August of this year, 2026. Pre-sales are available right now, but I think if people go to braindefenders.com, they can learn what the book is all about, read the endorsements. For whatever reason, we've already sold this book to 15 languages, 15 countries.
Amazing.
So I think it's going to be a game changer for at least, our understanding that we got to move away from this idea of if we can get rid of beta amyloid in your brain, problem solved.
Please, let's leave that in the bed.
Basically putting the ball back on our side of the court, that we have to make better decisions so we don't have to be thinking about an Alzheimer's drug for ourselves and our loved ones.
Well, you have a great rest of your day, David. Thank you so much for all of your work. And please, everybody, check it out, braindefenders.com. And I wish you a great rest of your day.
Thank you,
Take
Scott.
care.
It's been great to see you.
Likewise.